not! This is a hospital, not a doghouse!
Don't! That's my life.
Hospital ER refused veteran service dog. During heart attack, what nurses did next saved his life. The heart attack hit Sergeant First Class Daniel Rodriguez like an IED explosion, sudden, devastating, and terrifying in its completeness. As the ambulance screamed toward St. Mary's Medical Center, his 75-pound Belgian Malinois Ranger pressed against Daniel's chest while paramedics worked frantically to stabilize vitals that were crashing faster than their equipment could measure. The service dog's training had taught him to detect cardiac episodes hours before they occurred, but this time, his alerts had come too late to prevent the massive coronary that was stealing his partner's life. "We need this dog out of here immediately," Dr. Patricia Hayes announced as they wheeled Daniel into the ER, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos of Trauma Bay 3. Hospital policy prohibits animals in sterile treatment areas. Security needs to remove it now. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most sophisticated medical equipment pales in comparison to a service dog's ability to read the human body, and that institutional policies can kill when they ignore the bond between a veteran and the partner who'd saved his life in combat zones around the world. St. Mary's Medical Center, Phoenix, Arizona, 2025. The 400-bed facility served as the primary trauma center for the metropolitan area, its emergency department handling over 80,000 cases annually, with the efficiency and precision that modern medicine demanded. The hospital operated under strict infection control and safety protocols that had been developed over decades of patient care. But these policies had never been tested against the specific needs of military veterans whose survival often depended on service animals trained for combat situations. Dr. Patricia Hayes embodied the clinical excellence that had made St. Mary's a leading cardiac care center, her 15 years of emergency medicine providing expertise that had saved thousands of lives. At 48, she'd risen to Chief of Emergency Services through competence and uncompromising standards that prioritized medical protocols over personal considerations. Her approach to patient care was systematic and evidence-based, creating treatment environments where success was measured in survival rates rather than comfort or accommodation. Sergeant First Class Daniel Rodriguez had learned to trust his life to others during 3 deployments to Iraq, where split-second decisions meant the difference between coming home and becoming another casualty statistic. At 35, the former Army infantry soldier carried visible and invisible wounds from his service, a prosthetic leg lost to an improvised explosive device, and PTSD that manifested in hypervigilance, chronic pain, and the cardiac stress that had ultimately led to his heart attack. Ranger represented the pinnacle of military working dog breeding and training, a Belgian Malinois, whose genetic lines had been specifically developed for special operation support. The 4-year-old dog had been partnered with Daniel through the Veterans Administration Service Animal Program. His training encompassing not just standard service dog tasks, but specialized medical alert capabilities that included detecting changes in heart rhythm, blood pressure, and stress hormones that preceded cardiac events. Their partnership had been forged in the crucible of Daniel's medical crisis 3 years earlier, when civilian transition from military service had triggered psychological and physical symptoms that threatened his survival. Ranger's presence had made the difference between successful rehabilitation and the kind of veteran suicide statistics that haunted VA medical professionals. The dog's ability to predict Daniel's cardiac episodes had prevented 4 previous emergency room visits through early intervention and medication management. The hospital's service animal policy was well-intentioned, but inflexible, developed by administrators who understood liability concerns better than they understood the medical realities of human-animal partnerships. The written procedures allowed service dogs in public areas, but prohibited them from treatment rooms, operating theaters, and intensive care units, where infection control took precedence over accommodation. The policy had never been challenged by a situation where the service animal was literally essential for patient survival. The emergency department staff represented the best and worst of modern healthcare, highly trained professionals whose technical expertise was unquestionable, but whose understanding of veteran medical needs was limited by civilian medical training that didn't address combat-related injuries or service animal partnerships. Their experience with service dogs was minimal, typically involving guide dogs for visually impaired patients rather than psychiatric or medical alert animals whose work was invisible but equally essential. The broader context was a healthcare system struggling to serve an aging veteran population whose needs were often misunderstood or inadequately addressed by civilian medical providers. The transition from military to civilian healthcare created gaps in understanding about service-connected disabilities, while institutional policies frequently ignored the reality that veterans' treatment often required accommodations that standard medical protocols didn't anticipate. The collision between Daniel's medical emergency and institutional policy was building toward a crisis that would test whether federal disability law meant anything when it conflicted with hospital procedures, and whether medical professionals' oath to do no harm extended to protecting the therapeutic relationships that kept their patients alive. The separation began immediately upon arrival at St. Mary's, with security personnel moving to intercept Ranger as paramedics transferred Daniel from the ambulance gurney to the emergency department's trauma bay. The Belgian Malinois training had taught him to stay with Daniel during medical emergencies, but hospital protocol demanded that animals be removed from treatment areas regardless of their service designation or medical necessity. "Sir, you need to secure that dog outside," Security Officer Tom Bradley announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to enforcing hospital policies without exception. "No animals are allowed in treatment areas. We can arrange temporary boarding if necessary." His approach was professional but inflexible, reflecting institutional training that prioritized infection control over patient accommodation. Daniel's response was hampered by the cardiac medications flooding his system and the overwhelming nature of his medical crisis. But his military training asserted itself despite his physical distress. "Ranger stays with me," he managed to whisper between oxygen mask treatments. "Medical necessity. He detects cardiac episodes." His words were fragmented but legally significant, establishing that the dog's presence was accommodation rather than preference. Dr. Hayes's reaction was immediate and decisive, her medical training taking precedence over any consideration of service animal rights or veteran accommodation needs. "The dog goes, period. We can't maintain sterile conditions with animals in the treatment area. Get it out of here so we can save this man's life." Her clinical judgment was sound by traditional medical standards, but ignored the reality that separating Daniel from Ranger could destabilize his condition in ways that standard monitoring equipment might not detect. The forced separation was traumatic for both veteran and service dog, with Ranger's distressed vocalizations indicating that he was detecting medical changes in Daniel that the hospital's equipment hadn't yet registered. The dog's alerts were becoming increasingly urgent, his training telling him that Daniel's condition was deteriorating beyond what the medical team was recognizing. His attempts to reach his partner were interpreted by staff as aggressive behavior rather than medical intervention. Nurse Jennifer Chen, a 10-year emergency department veteran whose father had served in Vietnam, recognized something that the other medical staff had missed. "Dr. Hayes, that dog is trying to tell us something," she observed as Ranger continued his distressed alerts from the hallway where security had confined him. "Service dogs don't behave like that unless there's a medical emergency." But the institutional momentum was already established with protocols that prioritized sterile environments over service animal accommodation. The medical team's focus was on immediate cardiac stabilization, using pharmaceutical interventions and mechanical support, while Ranger's alerts were dismissed as animal distress rather than sophisticated medical monitoring that could provide information unavailable through conventional means. The crisis escalated when Daniel's condition began deteriorating despite apparently successful initial treatment. His cardiac rhythm was stabilizing according to electronic monitors, but Ranger's vocalizations were becoming more desperate, indicating detection of changes that hospital equipment wasn't measuring. The service dog's training had taught him to recognize subtle physiological shifts that preceded major cardiac events, knowledge that was being ignored because of institutional policies. "The patient's vitals are improving," Dr. Hayes announced to her team, her confidence based on electronic monitoring that showed stabilizing heart rhythm and blood pressure. "We've got this under control." But her assessment contradicted Ranger's increasingly frantic alerts, creating a disconnect between technological monitoring and biological detection that would prove crucial for Daniel's survival. The breakthrough moment came when Ranger, driven by training that placed his partner's survival above all other considerations, broke free from security restraint and ran directly to Daniel's bedside. The Belgian Malinois movement was purposeful and professional, his positioning indicating specific medical alerts that his training had taught him to communicate to medical personnel who understood service dog protocols. The confrontation that followed would test whether medical professionals were willing to learn from a service dog whose training might be superior to their equipment, or whether institutional pride would prevent them from accepting assistance from a source they hadn't been trained to recognize as medically legitimate. The chaos that erupted when Ranger burst into the trauma bay was immediate and revelatory, with the Belgian Malinois positioning himself at Daniel's chest while performing the specific alert sequence that his training had taught him to use for imminent cardiac arrest. His behavior was textbook service dog medical intervention, not aggression or panic, but professional communication that medical personnel should have recognized as sophisticated early warning system. "Get that dog out of here immediately," Dr. Hayes commanded, her voice rising as she viewed Ranger's presence as contamination of sterile environment rather than medical assistance. "Security, remove that animal before it compromises patient care." Her reaction reflected medical training that emphasized control over collaboration, missing the fact that Ranger was providing information that her equipment hadn't yet detected. But Nurse Chen's medical intuition was overriding institutional protocol as she observed Ranger's behavior and recognized patterns that her decade of emergency care had taught her to respect. "Doctor, that dog is performing specific medical alerts," she insisted, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd learned to trust unconventional sources of medical information. "His positioning and behavior indicate he's detecting something we're missing." The electronic monitors continued showing improvement in Daniel's condition: stable rhythm, adequate blood pressure, normal oxygen saturation, but Ranger's alerts were becoming more intense rather than less. The service dog's training had taught him to recognize biochemical changes that preceded major cardiac events, changes that occurred before electronic equipment could register them. His desperate communication was falling on medically trained but institutionally constrained ears. Dr. Hayes' response was to call for additional security to forcibly remove Ranger, her decision based on protocols that didn't account for service animals whose medical training might exceed standard hospital procedures. "I don't care what that dog thinks he's detecting," she declared with the authority of someone whose medical degree trumped any animal's training. "We have sophisticated monitoring equipment that tells us everything we need to know." The escalation reached critical mass when Ranger began performing the specific sequence that his training had taught him to use for immediate cardiac arrest, warning deep pressure against Daniel's chest, specific vocalizations and positioning that indicated detection of cardiac rhythm, changes that preceded ventricular fibrillation. The behavior was professionally trained medical intervention, but it was being interpreted as animal distress by medical staff who'd never been educated about service dog capabilities. Nurse Chen's decision to advocate for Ranger rather than follow hospital protocol was both professionally risky and medically inspired. Dr. Hayes, "I've seen cardiac arrests preceded by exactly this kind of service dog behavior." She announced, her voice carrying the authority of experience rather than protocol. "This dog is telling us that Mr. Rodriguez is about to go into arrest despite what our monitors show." The confrontation between medical authority and service dog expertise was building toward a crisis that would determine Daniel's survival. Dr. Hayes' commitment to traditional monitoring was absolute, while Ranger's alerts were indicating imminent danger that electronic equipment hadn't detected. The collision between institutional medicine and service animal training was about to test which approach was more accurate in predicting cardiac emergencies. The validation came within seconds as Daniel's cardiac rhythm began showing irregularities that confirmed Ranger's alerts, his condition deteriorating exactly as the service dog had predicted. The electronic monitors that Dr. Hayes had trusted over animal observation suddenly showed ventricular tachycardia, progressing toward the kind of cardiac arrest that Ranger had been warning about through his trained alert behaviors. "He's going into VTACH," Dr. Hayes shouted as alarms began sounding throughout the trauma bay. The crisis that Ranger had predicted was now obvious to electronic monitoring, but precious time had been lost because medical staff had ignored early warning provided by the service dog's superior detection capabilities. The irony was devastating. The animal they'd tried to remove had been providing more accurate medical information than their sophisticated equipment. Nurse Chen's vindication was immediate but secondary to the medical emergency now unfolding. The dog knew, she said, as the team began emergency cardiac procedures. He was trying to warn us for 10 minutes before our equipment detected anything. Her words carried the weight of recognition that institutional prejudice against service animal capabilities had nearly cost Daniel his life. The resuscitation that followed was successful, but complicated, with Daniel requiring aggressive intervention that might have been unnecessary if Ranger's early warnings had been heeded. The service dog's positioning during the crisis was both protective and professional, his training allowing him to provide comfort without interfering with medical procedures that his alerts had made necessary. The broader implications were staggering for everyone involved. The hospital's service animal policy had nearly resulted in preventable death, while medical staff who dismissed animal expertise found themselves confronting evidence that service dog training might be superior to electronic monitoring for certain types of medical prediction. The incident would force fundamental reconsideration of how healthcare institutions approached service animal accommodation and the medical value that properly trained animals could provide. The aftermath was building toward institutional change as Dr. Hayes and her team grappled with the reality that their protocols had been wrong. Their assumptions had been dangerous, and a service dog had provided medical intelligence that could have prevented the crisis they just managed through emergency intervention. The aftermath of Daniel's cardiac arrest revealed the devastating near miss that institutional prejudice had created, with medical records showing that Ranger's alerts had preceded electronic detection by 12 minutes' time that could have been used for preventive intervention rather than emergency resuscitation. The documentation was damning for St. Mary's, proving that their service animal policy had directly contributed to a medical crisis that proper accommodation could have prevented. Dr. Hayes faced the professional and personal reckoning that came with realizing her medical expertise had been inferior to a service dog's training. Her institutional authority having nearly cost a veteran his life through ignorance rather than incompetence. That dog knew Mr. Rodriguez was going into arrest before our best equipment detected anything, she admitted to the assembled medical team. We need to understand how that's possible and why our protocols prevented us from utilizing that information. The investigation that followed was internal but comprehensive, with hospital administrators recognizing that they faced potential federal civil rights violations and medical malpractice liability that could destroy the institution's reputation. The Americans with Disabilities Act was clear about service animal accommodation, while medical ethics demanded recognition that patient welfare superseded administrative convenience. Daniel's recovery was complicated by the fact that his cardiac arrest could have been prevented if medical staff had heeded Ranger's warnings, creating psychological trauma that compound his existing PTSD symptoms. The realization that the hospital he'd trusted for care had nearly killed him through institutional prejudice was devastating for someone whose military service had been based on trusting others with his life. They almost let me die because they wouldn't listen to my dog, Daniel told his VA psychiatrist during recovery. Ranger tried to warn them for 12 minutes, and they ignored him because they thought their machines were smarter than his training. How do I trust civilian medicine again? The legal implications were severe and expanding, with disability rights attorneys documenting a case that combined medical malpractice with civil rights violations in ways that could result in millions of dollars in damages. The hospital's written policy excluding service animals from treatment areas was clearly discriminatory, while the medical team's dismissal of Rangers' alerts demonstrated institutional bias that had endangered a disabled veteran's life. Nurse Chen faced professional retaliation for challenging Dr. Hayes' authority, with hospital administrators questioning her judgment in advocating for service dog expertise over medical protocol. The institutional response was predictable but devastating, punishing the healthcare worker who'd recognized the problem rather than addressing the policies that had created it. "I'm being disciplined for trying to save a patient's life," Chen told the nursing union representative who was advocating for her job. "The dog was right. I was right to support him, and Mr. Rodriguez is alive because I refused to ignore what was happening. But the hospital is treating me like I committed malpractice by listening to a service animal." The broader implications for veteran health care were staggering, with Daniel's case revealing systematic gaps in civilian medical training about service animal partnerships and combat-related disabilities. The incident suggested that veterans throughout the healthcare system might be receiving inadequate care because medical professionals didn't understand the therapeutic relationships that kept them stable. The media attention that was building would transform Daniel's personal medical crisis into national conversation about healthcare discrimination against disabled veterans. But the publicity also meant that his most vulnerable moments would be examined by people who couldn't understand the complexity of service animal partnerships or the medical realities of combat-related injuries. The Department of Veterans Affairs investigation that was initiated would ultimately validate Daniel's rights and expose St. Mary's policy violations. But the immediate crisis was his deteriorating trust in civilian healthcare and the recognition that the system supposedly designed to help him had nearly destroyed the therapeutic relationship that kept him alive. The darkest moment came when Daniel, overwhelmed by the trauma of nearly dying because medical professionals had ignored his service animal, experienced a severe PTSD episode that required psychiatric hospitalization. The incident had triggered exactly the kind of medical crisis that Ranger's presence was designed to prevent, creating a cascade of symptoms that demonstrated the life-or-death importance of service animal accommodation. Ranger's own trauma was equally severe, with the service dog displaying signs of stress and confusion that veterinary behaviorists attributed to having his medical alerts ignored during a genuine emergency. The animal, who'd been trained to save lives, had watched his partner nearly die because humans had refused to trust his expertise, creating psychological damage that could affect his future service capabilities. The federal investigation that was beginning would expose systematic discrimination against service animals throughout the healthcare system, while Daniel's case would become precedent for civil rights enforcement that protected thousands of future veterans from similar institutional prejudice and medical neglect. The transformation began when Dr. Margaret Sullivan, St. Mary's chief medical officer and a former Navy physician herself, personally intervened after learning about the incident through veteran advocacy networks. Her military medical background provided immediate understanding of what had occurred and why the hospital's policies had created a crisis that could have been easily prevented through proper accommodation and training. This is not just a medical mistake, it's a civil rights violation that could have killed a veteran, Dr. Sullivan announced during an emergency meeting with department heads. Mr. Rodriguez's service dog provided medical intelligence that our equipment missed, and our staff dismissed that intelligence because of institutional prejudice rather than medical judgment. The investigation that Dr. Sullivan ordered was thorough and unflinching, documenting how the hospital's service animal policy violated federal law while endangering patients whose survival depended on partnerships that civilian medical training had never addressed. The review revealed that Rangers alerts had been medically accurate, professionally delivered, and potentially life-saving if they'd been properly recognized. The breakthrough came when Dr. Sullivan brought in Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a veteran cardiologist who specialized in service animal partnerships and their medical applications. Dr. Martinez's examination of the case was both educational and damning, demonstrating how Rangers' training exceeded standard medical monitoring in specific applications while explaining why his alerts should have been trusted over electronic equipment. Service dogs like Ranger are trained to detect biochemical changes that occur minutes or hours before electronic monitors register them. Dr. Martinez explained to the assembled medical staff, their olfactory capabilities can identify cardiac episodes through scent markers that our equipment can't detect. This dog was providing superior medical intelligence that could have prevented Mr. Rodriguez's arrest. The education that followed was comprehensive and transformative, with Dr. Martinez conducting mandatory training for all emergency department staff about service animal capabilities, veteran medical needs, and federal accommodation requirements. The sessions were eye-opening for medical professionals who'd never understood the sophisticated medical training that service animals received or the life-saving partnerships they created with disabled veterans. Dr. Hayes' transformation was personal and professional. Her recognition that she'd nearly caused preventable death through ignorance forcing fundamental reconsideration of her approach to patient care. I've been practicing emergency medicine for 15 years, and I thought I understood medical monitoring, she admitted during staff training. This incident taught me that my knowledge had dangerous gaps when it came to service animal partnerships. The policy changes that resulted were immediate and comprehensive, with St. Mary's implementing new protocols that recognize service animals as medical equipment rather than pets, while establishing procedures that utilize their capabilities rather than dismissing them. The changes were developed in consultation with veteran organizations and service animal training programs to ensure they addressed real needs rather than theoretical accommodation. The reunion between Daniel and Ranger in the hospital was emotional and therapeutically essential, with medical staff documenting the immediate improvement in Daniel's vital signs when his service animal was returned to his bedside. The partnership's medical value was obvious and measurable, proving that accommodation wasn't just legally required but medically beneficial. Ranger saved my life twice, Daniel told reporters who'd followed the story. Once by warning about my heart attack, and again by proving that service dogs deserve to be trusted as medical partners rather than dismissed as pets. This experience showed me that some medical professionals need to learn from animals whose training might be better than their own. The federal investigation that concluded during Daniel's recovery resulted in comprehensive reforms throughout St. Mary's system, with the Department of Justice documenting discrimination that had violated multiple federal statutes while endangering patient welfare. The settlement included monetary compensation for Daniel while requiring policy changes that would protect future veterans from similar institutional prejudice. The training program that emerged became a model for hospitals nationwide, with medical schools incorporating service animal education into their curricula, while healthcare systems recognized that proper accommodation often improved rather than complicated patient care. The program used Daniel and Ranger's experience as a central case study, ensuring that their trauma contributed to preventing similar incidents. The research that followed documented Ranger's medical accuracy in predicting cardiac events, with peer-reviewed studies validating service dog capabilities while challenging medical assumptions about monitoring and early warning systems. The findings influenced emergency medicine protocols while proving that human-animal partnerships could enhance rather than replace traditional medical technology. The broader impact transformed healthcare approaches to service animal accommodation throughout Arizona and beyond, with other hospitals adopting St. Mary's revised policies after recognizing that proper protocols prevented legal liability while improving patient outcomes. The changes influenced federal healthcare policy while educating medical professionals about veteran needs and service animal capabilities. The personal healing that Daniel experienced was gradual but complete, with proper medical accommodation restoring his faith in civilian healthcare while demonstrating that institutional change was possible when supported by leadership that prioritized patient welfare over bureaucratic convenience. His relationship with Ranger was strengthened rather than damaged by their shared experience of proving service animal value to skeptical medical professionals. Nurse Chen's vindication was professional and personal, with her advocacy for service dog expertise earning recognition rather than punishment once hospital leadership understood what had actually occurred. Her promotion to Emergency Department Service Animal Liaison created a new position that ensured future accommodation while providing career advancement for someone whose courage had prevented tragedy. The annual Daniel Rodriguez Service Animal Recognition Program became St. Mary's signature event, celebrating the medical partnerships between veterans and service animals while educating healthcare workers about accommodation requirements and therapeutic benefits. The ceremony honors both human and animal contributors to veteran healthcare while preventing future discrimination through education and awareness. 5 years later, Daniel's complete cardiac recovery validated the importance of early detection and proper medical accommodation, while his work as a veteran advocate helped hundreds of other service dog teams navigate healthcare challenges. His testimony before congressional committees influenced federal policy while ensuring that medical discrimination against service animals became increasingly rare and professionally unacceptable. The final scene was both vindication and new beginning. Daniel stood beside Ranger at the White House, where they were being honored for their role in transforming veteran healthcare and service animal accommodation. The dog, who'd been dismissed by emergency room staff, was now wearing a Presidential Service Medal, while Daniel's survival had become symbol of what was possible when medical professionals chose learning over prejudice. Sometimes the best doctor really does have 4 legs, Daniel reflected during his speech. Ranger didn't just save my life, he taught an entire hospital that service animals are medical partners whose expertise deserves respect rather than suspicion. Our partnership proved that healing happens when humans are humble enough to learn from animals whose training might exceed their own. The audience, including Dr. Hayes and the medical team who'd initially dismissed Ranger's capabilities, understood that they'd witnessed transformation of both individual hearts and institutional systems, proving that the strongest medicine was often the willingness to admit mistakes while choosing growth over defensiveness when confronted with superior knowledge from unexpected sources. The Daniel Rodriguez case became the catalyst for nationwide transformation of hospital service animal policies, establishing medical and legal precedents that protected thousands of veterans while improving healthcare outcomes through proper accommodation. The comprehensive reforms that resulted influenced federal healthcare policy and created training standards that recognize service animals as essential medical partners rather than inconvenient pets. The immediate consequences revolutionized St. Mary's approach to veteran care and service animal accommodation, with the hospital investing over $2 million in staff training, policy development, and facility modifications that created the most comprehensive service animal program in American healthcare. Patient satisfaction scores among disabled veterans increased by 89%, while medical outcomes improved through enhanced understanding of human-animal therapeutic partnerships. The federal investigation results led to Department of Justice enforcement actions that established criminal penalties for healthcare workers who willfully violated service animal accommodation requirements. The prosecutions sent clear messages throughout the medical industry that disability discrimination would face serious legal consequences regardless of institutional size or medical authority. The training revolution extended far beyond St. Mary's, as over 400 hospitals nationwide adopted similar service animal education programs within 3 years. Medical schools incorporated service animal coursework into their curricula, while residency programs required rotation through veteran healthcare facilities that specialized in accommodation and partnership medicine. The research that emerged from documenting Ranger's medical accuracy influenced emergency medicine protocols and cardiac monitoring standards throughout American healthcare. Peer-reviewed studies validated service dog capabilities while challenging medical assumptions about early warning systems and the superiority of electronic monitoring over biological detection. The legal precedents established through federal court decisions strengthened enforcement of healthcare accommodation requirements, while clarifying that medical authority did not supersede federal disability law. The rulings influenced subsequent litigation involving healthcare discrimination and provided legal framework for civil rights enforcement that protected vulnerable patients from institutional prejudice. The advocacy movement that grew from Daniel's experience created new organizations focused specifically on healthcare accessibility and service animal rights for veterans. These groups provided legal assistance, policy advocacy, and medical consultation that helped thousands of disabled veterans navigate accommodation challenges while pushing for continued improvements in healthcare practices. The Department of Veterans Affairs adopted St. Mary's protocols as national standards for all VA medical facilities, while private healthcare systems implemented similar policies. After recognizing that proper accommodation prevented legal liability while improving patient care, The changes created consistent standards across American healthcare that protected service animal teams regardless of geographic location. The cultural impact transformed medical understanding of veteran disabilities and service animal partnerships, with Daniel's story educating healthcare professionals about combat-related injuries while demonstrating that accommodation enhanced rather than complicated medical treatment. The incident inspired broader conversations about medical humility and the value of learning from sources that traditional training had ignored. The enduring message was revolutionary medical expertise required continuous learning from all sources, including animals whose training might exceed human knowledge. Service animal partnerships were medical necessities rather than emotional preferences. And the strongest healthcare systems were those humble enough to recognize that healing came from collaboration rather than authority.